What brought me to Playa is actually a bit of chance and a bit of universal magic, I would say. I was living in Minnesota some 24 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, and I really decided to point my life in a new direction. And the beginning of pointing my life in a new direction was to take a break from things and go learn Spanish. And I specifically had a very strong prayer. And that prayer was to learn Spanish in a set of circumstances that would be best and produce the most value in my life. And it was a very strong, earnest prayer. And Puerto Rico is what came out at the end of it. I did not have plans to come to Puerto Rico, but Puerto Rico had plans for me. I can see the intersection between the environment and communities and people. And that is actually the intersection and land use that's been very, very interesting to me for quite a few years. So I find myself in the unique, I think it's unique place of being both a member of our community I'm a neighbor within the barrio that has, I want to say, 24 different communities, 11,000 people. But I'm also an activist. Um, and I'm also approaching things now with a theoretical and a research perspective. The circumstances for my life are really about creating value for the society in which I live, in the place where I am now. And I just think that we have a social responsibility to be good neighbors. End of sentence. We have social responsibility to be good neighbors. To give people a sense of Playa de Ponce, I would like to kind of share some of my impressions and some of the badges of pride I think that the community has for itself. The people are humble, proud, and have a lot of faith from what I can see. There's a small business sector, and I would say that I can't think of a chain business that's even in this area. And we have some very strong institutions. We've got the Centro Sor Iselina Ferre, which is a community development institution that was formed by a nun who retired and began her practice as a retired nun in Playa de Ponce. There are churches, historic churches, new churches. Um, we have our own carnival with our own carnival traditions and masks. There are beautiful murals. We've got two really amazing artists who have installed themselves in Playa. And then there's the nature in this urban area. We have a beach. We've got three rivers that roll through. Um, it's just a curious place, and it's got its beauty, and it has its challenges. In the 1970s, Playa had a population of about 20,000 people. Today, our population is about 11,000 people. And from looking at aerial photography and reading some historic documentation and kind of doing some ballpark calculations, I can see that we have between 2,000 and 4,000 people who were displaced for commercial interests and economic development for others in Playa. What we see here in many communities as well is the focused concentration of economic development activity for a particular part of a city. But it presents itself as, a richness. But then, you go a block or two or three blocks away and you really see how people are living. And so in the same barrio, you've got spaces where people squatted, built, and persisted. And then you've got areas where those squats were eliminated and replaced with formalized, urbanized areas. And that economic development may have improved people's circumstances, but has never brought equity to the circumstances under which people live. As a society, it should be highly objectionable that we are producing the dynamic that displaces already poor people, removes them from their environment that sustains them, and then just puts them out wherever they can find a place to live. I've lived in Playa for a little more than 2 decades now. And in that time period, I would say that my awareness of climate change was zero when I moved here. And it is much stronger having been through a hurricane. Um, and then much stronger having interacted with the neighbors who are being flooded, who have shared their stories. And and I will say that the amount of coastal storm surge that reaches farther inland in some areas is really quite stunning. For Fiona, which wasn't a lot of wind, but some wind and a lot of rain. We had sturgeon in people's yards, I want to say 3/4 of a mile from the ocean. Sturgeon in their yards, swimming. And so it didn't used to be like that. But there's also a practice of fill and build here and to the north of us, which our neighbors claim has produced more flooding because we are down gradient. And so those floodwaters that can no longer percolate into the soil are now pushed through the neighborhoods, thus increasing the amount of water that pours through already aged infrastructure, which wasn't built for the capacity of water that it needs to handle today. We spent last year, as many places in the world, with extreme temperatures. And I think we began in May to receive heat advisories. So heat days of 111, 115 degrees. And that lasted all the way through September. It was extremely hot. And remember, we are still recovering from Hurricane Maria, and our electric grid is still delicate. The combination of extreme heat and aging population and power outages is actually a recipe for another kind of disaster. And it's very worrisome. We're seeing spatial abandonment in areas that are flooding. I could see evidence of homes that were there that are no longer there with, pylons and things that look like foundations, buried kind of in the sand. We are seeing neighbors who have businesses right on the shoreline, and they're not able to acquire insurance any longer. And they're having to really rethink. And so we may see a scaled retreat, which would be difficult. The effects of flooding and the effects of climate are spatially dispersed and distributed not uniformly. FEMA has almost the entire barrio as a flood zone, and this is just not correct in terms of what people are living and seeing. There are areas that, because of the flooding, have received more attention in Puerto Viejo community, for instance, but there are areas that have received promises for 4 decades to address flooding issues, and the public intervention has been really wanting. This is a manifestation of distribution of protective infrastructure that's also spatially driven and economically driven. And then I would say that, as we've seen in North America's history of the displacement that's occurred because of blight elimination project, and then the replacement of those populations, and the way that institutions have really deepened their their richness because of that. It appears that this same kind of activity could well occur in Playa as well because of the North American investment, the Americans who want to live near the water. In lieu of a comprehensive strategy across our barrio or even our city or Puerto Rico to deal with climate change, people adapt autonomously, and they'll adapt autonomously within the capacity of their social capital, what they can tap in terms of their financial capital, how deep are their pockets and what can they accomplish with that. And you see that spatially manifest in different forms. People building berms, building their homes up on berms, people covering their patios with cement and creating barriers so the water can't enter. People putting their homes up on pylons so the water doesn't damage their goods. That has a benefit of cooling because the air can get under a house as well. It's not uncommon to see this kind of autonomous adaptation happening elsewhere in the Caribbean. I received a phone call from Pastor Roberto, who is a well-known member of the Playa barrio and the Playa communities. And he said, look, we've got an issue with flooding and we have an issue with sewage water flooding. And he said, I've read about your work in an adjacent community, and I'm wondering if there's something that you could do for us. Well, I had no idea what I was going to do for him, but as things happen, that same week, a notification came out from EPA that they were soliciting applications for the loan of water testing equipment that could be used to test ambient water. I said, do you think you can get a brigade together so we can do water testing? He said, yes. And so fast forward, they did a great project. We did a fantastic project together. We raised the money. We learned how to test water. But it was really the community members that did all the heavy lifting here. They did a marvelous job of collecting water quality samples. I think it was across 11 different sites over a 3-month period on a regular basis. And we were able to produce at the end of it, I produced a map that showed the degree of concentrations of this dangerous bacteria. And we related it to flooding that happened in actually some of Playa's poorest communities. So being embedded in the community, I had a sense what was going on that was being problematic in people's environment. Flooding was obviously one of those things. The abandonment of space, people just giving up their homes, maybe a person dying, nobody in the family interested in the home, or the homes not recovering following disaster, has left the sense of abandonment to various sectors in Playa. And I thought, well, there's some money that is available. It looks like if we were to do an inventory and also document lived experience with flooding, that might position us to actually have enough data to be able to attend to that issue, or at least attempt to. And so we got some technical assistance support, trained a community brigade to go out and spatially document with tablets, handheld tablets, into ArcGIS with a trained eye to not document properties that really looked like they needed some love, but that were really clearly places where people were living. Those did not enter into our inventory. And so we had the inventory created with a justice kind of perspective, if you will. 170 sites across a good portion of the barrio were documented. And then we documented the lived experience with flooding, which contrasts greatly to the very problematic FEMA maps that we have for this area. And this became an amazing talking point and an amazing advocacy point. We co-designed with community members a survey instrument that was culturally and language appropriate for Puerto Rico vernacular, and asking questions that we felt would be helpful in us understanding at a household level what is a household's experience with flooding in the areas that we knew were the most challenged in that regard. And we produced an amazing amount of data. Again, 240 households responded. We were able to correlate sort of these areas where there's spatial abandonment, where there's flooding occurring based on people's lived experience, having documented that, and also this desire to either leave the neighborhood because they can't take the flooding anymore, or because people are so place attached after living in the community for 30, 40 years that people don't want to leave. And so it presents a moral case then to our municipality and our government officials that we have a human rights issue here, that we have people in housing that are in danger. They are vulnerable adults, many of them elderly people. And the moral claim is help people find safe housing or fix the problems with infrastructure in the community. Parallel to the desires, or perhaps in juxtaposition to the desires of residents that are being expressed to us, are the economic interests and the economic plans that have been created without any participation from our public at all. There are plans to exploit, they call it the blue economy, to exploit the ocean. Nobody's spoken to our neighbors about that. There's a new economic development hub for our region, an EDA initiative, again, supported by local elites, that have set a trajectory for economic development that could affect our community. Again, no one's spoken to our community about these things. They're pursuing a major grant with the EPA Community Change grant to actually shore up the infrastructure for our facility and Nueva Manifestares facility, so it can be a point of resilience for the community, a stronger point of resilience for the community, but also to do some green infrastructure investment. Success in Playa might look like new housing, safer housing, addressing beautification issues, making sure the streets are clean, making sure that people don't convert these sites into public dumps, taking care of the issue of stray animals. People are looking for places to socialize together. They're looking for places that they can recreate sort of passively, not a football field or a track, but, like a park with some benches. Some of our neighbors are foragers. They enjoy, crabbing, hunting for crabs, fishing, and to have a future where these things can continue, I think might be important for people as well. I think that living in fear is just really a place that is not a good state to live in. And so success might look like more cohesion within our community and just a better sense of overall well-being in place. There's nothing that a single actor can do that is really going to change the world in a way that's going to be positive for people. The best that we can hope for is and work for is to create islands of sanity where we are. And I use that to guide my actions.